This committee, we're going to get started. We have a number of items on the agenda. If you've been to the committee in the past, you know that you put out cards, and we'll make sure you get your comments as to specific items on the agenda. If you want to make public comment on items that are within the purview of this committee but may not be on the agenda, you can make out a public comment card. And so if you've not made a card out, please make one out now so that we can, as we go through the items, we'll be glad to have your comments as part of the record. And I'm joined by Mr. Zine, also on this committee, so we can get started on item 1.
Item number 1 is a verbal report from the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment General Manager relative to the status of revamping all aspects of the current financial system for tracking, documenting, and reconciling neighborhood council expenditures, including encumbrances and invoice payments, and the proposed implementation of standardized requirements with which each neighborhood council must comply in order to receive its annual budget appropriation.
Okay. Before we get started, let me just ask, we have one card. Ida, would you come up and make it?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am really disturbed that these are all verbal reports, because there is very little to take back to the community when you don't have a document in your hand. And it's very hard trying to contradict misinformation in the public purview within one's community if there isn't anything written. I'm concerned about that. I am concerned about the numerous changes that Dan has continually spoken about, beginning with the 50 changes that were to have occurred in 2007 after the Neighborhood Council Review Commission. Subsequent to that, there's been changes in the Treasurer's report continually, and there have been also changes when Dan has said, this is your deadline. It has changed it about 4 times in the ensuing weeks that it has set out. I'm also concerned with the fact that Dan has not held neighborhood councils accountable during the period in which they are having their tenure. Now, Greater Echo Park is having to deal with things that the past board has incurred. We are paying out monies that are a debt that the previous board had. I think such things happen because there is no transition policy. We're done 3 months before a neighborhood council is dissolved, takes a look at its finances. I think these things are absolutely needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just comment on one thing. The reason that we are doing verbal reports is everyone's aware that the staff is very minimal, and if we ask the general manager to be making multiple written reports, they don't have the staff. And these are items, the reason they're verbal is they're in process and they're developing procedures that will end up being in a report. So these are momentary updates on a variety of issues. So that's why we've not imposed upon the general manager to write reports every meeting, but to give us a verbal update on the activities dealing with these subjects.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I also think that there is a newsletter that is sent out by Ms. Liu that can include some of this.
Yes,
Thank you.
she has a very good newsletter. Why don't you give us an update on number 1?
Good afternoon, council members and stakeholders. Gracie Liu, General Manager of the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment. In regards to our funding program, we are currently doing 2 things. The first is looking at a new system of checking accounts that we could possibly set up for the neighborhood councils. And we did have a meeting last Friday with the CAO, CLA Controller, and Office of Treasurer. We looked at the options of how we could set up a system that would have adequate safeguards, and we are continuing our discussions with them. They are looking at how we do reconciliations currently and seeing where the neighborhood councils spend their funds so that we can capture everything that we will need to in order to set up proper safeguards. We are working with our consultant, Barker Corsani, on this, and he seems fairly positive that we'll be able to put something into place by July 1st. This would require an ordinance to carry out, and so we're also talking with the city attorney's office to see what possible language would be needed if we were to continue on this path. On the flip side, we are looking at how do we streamline current funding policies and procedures. I did do investigation in terms of the reconciliations that the neighborhood councils currently have to provide in regards to their purchase cards. As of the close of the second quarter, we have 71 neighborhood councils that are delinquent on their reconciliations. And
71?
correct, 71 out of the 95. And after 2 quarters of late reconciliations, then the department freezes their funds until they can provide the information. We will be notifying all of the neighborhood councils that are delinquent and letting them know that they are so, and giving them a deadline to provide that. And we expect in mid-March we'll be able to give you a better idea of where we are with that. The other thing with late reconciliations is that they won't be able to provide neighborhood purpose grants that they have the option of doing. You can only provide what we call these MPGs if your fiscal status is sound. So we will be notifying all the neighborhood councils about this. The other thing that we are doing is we're processing their demand warrants. We typically get about 175 to 200 demand warrants a month. In the past, what has happened is they come in incomplete, and when they do, we end up holding onto them, and there's sometimes confusion as to where the documents that are necessary to complete the package go. And so what was implemented under the former general manager was return of the demand warrant packet if it was incomplete. We have continued this process. However, we still receive about 15 to 30 demand warrants that are incomplete each week. These demand warrants, for us to return them, costs us $10 to $15 in postage. So we are looking to consider charging the neighborhood councils $20 to return these demand warrants, and so just to cover our postage and supplies. So these are the basic items that we are dealing with right now. And we close actually the demand warrant submissions by May 15th, so we've been trying to let the neighborhood councils know that if you need to spend down your funds, you have to do so now. But it will get awkward, I believe, in March when we may have to freeze some neighborhood council funds because of the late reconciliations.
Let me ask you, do you have a source of fund identified when you talk about the costs associated with setting up the checking accounts? Is that something that's already in play, or is that something that is a need to identify another source?
So what we did in our fiscal year 2013-14 budget, our proposed budget, we did identify some funds. We did request funds to help the transition, and I can speak more about that when we get to the agenda item. We also had $120,000 that was set aside from last year's salary savings, and it was set aside for an funding electronic platform. What we were hoping was to use those funds to help support this switch. However, it appears that the $120,000 was inadvertently left out of our current fiscal year funds. So we are looking to try to reinstate that, and any suggestions or help that the committee can provide in this matter would be much appreciated.
I am amazed, 71 out of 95 delinquent. How do we tolerate that?
Well, we are not, in the sense that we will be freezing funds for those neighborhood councils that are late, and that's pursuant to our current policies and procedures.
I mean, the past problem that we had with some of the neighborhood councils was funding some of the misappropriation of dollars, which was a few years ago. I thought we would have changed the process and got compliance, and it just seems that whatever is supposed to be happening is not happening. 71 out of 95, no reflection on you, if they don't want to comply, we're talking about taxpayers' dollars, what is the solution?
Well, as I mentioned before, in past meetings, the issue is really of capacity. We spend our time with either paying demand warrants or reviewing the reconciliations and doing audits. And because of, our short or a few number of funding staffers, we've been unable to really focus on the auditing side of it. And that's why what we're hoping, at least I'm hoping, is that with this change of the funding program, we can actually shift the tasks of paying the checks to the neighborhood council so that we can then focus on the audit function and we wouldn't necessarily be behind. And we're trying to actually catch up on these audits. I had to bring in a 120-day retired staffer from the controller's office so that we could even get these numbers about who was behind. They were not kept up for a while, and that's because they had to shift staff to payment section.
Well, we're talking about dollars. We're talking about accounting to have it fiscally responsible. I know that in the past there was equipment, cameras, recorders, a number of items that went missing when there was a change in the personnel elected neighborhood council. Correct that situation?
That's next on the list is inventory, and they initially did do. I believe several years ago there was before we were cut, they did start to try to help the neighborhood councils keep track of the inventory, but that has also kind of fallen aside because of the lack of staff.
That's the problem. If the inventory disappears and no one's accountable, and the money is not being accounted for, I mean, we're really not doing what we're supposed to do in running an operation, and they're not doing what they're supposed to do in representing the communities. So it's like some people are taking advantage of the system, and somehow it needs to be fixed. I thought that the audit function was already up and running when we had the debate in the past about the equipment. And then some people were arrested, and there was some misappropriation. I mean, somehow we need to get that online working like it should for everyone's benefit, for the people who live in the communities, as well as those individuals that go to those elections. We're spending a lot of money on elections to get people elected, and then when they take over the position, they're not complying with the rules that are governing neighborhood councils, and 71 out of 95. I mean, that's horrific.
Yes, I agree. It is a problem, and I think that the fact that we're trying to revamp the funding program so that we can actually take our eyes and our time off of the payments part of it so that we can address these other issues such as the audit and the inventory. I think that's really important, and it's difficult, as you know, in this fiscal climate where our funding staff, what you were mentioning before in terms of the audit function, the inventory, that was all done before we were cut by 60%, and our funding staff and the admin staff that I told about 8 now are down to 3. So it is a struggle to try to achieve both, but I do understand how dire it is in terms of keeping track of public funds and inventory that's paid with public funds. So we've definitely been trying to get on top of this.
Because I haven't seen it improve in 10 years. It just seems to continue with problems. And again, you're a new general manager there. You've seen it. I'm glad you're reporting it to us. But if we look back in the history, I'm sure it's just been one continuing trend, whether they have adequate personnel or not, because the personnel have to get trained and groomed and this and that and the other. It just seems that there's a $10 million department with the expenditures done.
I'm sorry.
We're talking $10 million to run the operation and all the intricacies in the department.
Yeah, it's about 8 million, 7 to 8 million, yes.
That's a lot of money that somehow people aren't accounting for. And since we have a past history that is not showing positive, it seems like that past history is just continuing through new administrations on neighborhood councils as the turnover takes place with new people coming in. But I don't know if the council officers can help. I don't know who can help, but somehow when you have 71 out of 95, I'd like to know in my district, in the 3rd district, what neighborhood councils aren't in compliance. And maybe if you sent it out to all of the council members, they could use their deputies or something to try and get folks online. I have quarterly meetings with the neighborhood council presidents in my district, And if any of them are in that batch of 71, I'd like to know.
I'd be happy to provide you that
I
information.
think the council officers, Mr. Parks, would be, they're not aware of it. I mean, we were not aware of it. So if we're not aware of it, they're not aware of it. I think maybe
Right.
the council officers can help, because I know I send representatives to every meeting they have. And that connection continues. And my representatives, my deputies, I'm sure think everything's fine. But if you could send that out to each, within the districts, District 8, District 13, District 3, whatever, these are your neighborhood councils, these are in compliance, these are not in compliance, and maybe we can have some influence.
Thank you very much. That would be very helpful. And we are in the process of notifying all the city council members because we just received these numbers last week.
Yeah, I think that would be, I'll offer what I can in my district.
Thank you very much.
Clearly help with that.
I appreciate that.
You got enough things to worry about.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parks.
Thank you. The one thing, and I think your efforts to hold back on the funds, if people don't comply, is going to be a major plus for the overall operation. I would just ask, as you move towards that you use your newsletter to let people know, that this is where we're going, so there will not be all of this activity once it's imposed to say, I didn't know anything about it. And I think it is important if we could get that, each council district gets the information directed to them as to who's in compliance and not in their district, then they can certainly help you on this activity. But I think the efforts you're making, from what I saw when I first got on the committee to today, we've made great strides in trying to make sense of the payment situation. And as I mentioned before, I think it is far more important that we hold the neighborhood councils accountable for their money and their reporting, so that Dunn doesn't get bogged down in auditing and checking and then take up all their time kicking stuff back. That's where I think that the situation became untenable before, is Dunn took on too much work and couldn't process the situation. I think it's up to, they're going to spend the money, it's up to them to keep accurate records and fill the reports out properly, or they get them kicked back. And like the report says, you will not get funded until you get these things done. I think that will get their attention more than anything else. So if we could ask that you continue to work with city staff. The one thing I was going to ask you, we will need an ordinance at some point, but you're going to have to create the system before the city attorney can do the ordinance. So how are you working that as far as timing? When you finish your report, will that ordinance come with it, or will it just recommend that an ordinance be forthcoming?
I would actually ask the city attorney on the timing of this. I'm not sure exactly what would be the best.
Deputy City Attorney Darren Martinez, usually what we do is we have the request come from council as a whole, asking us to instruct, to prepare the ordinance. If there's something, I think maybe we could work with the draft idea. In terms of the ordinance that would be required for the neighborhood council checking system, if you may recall, there was one at one time that was created, so that we do have language where there was neighborhood council checking account system. It occurred in conjunction with the donation ordinance. The ordinance itself was not that difficult, so it's not a difficult ordinance. It was more about ensuring that the parameters for protections were put in. So we're working in conjunction with the controller, the treasurer, to make sure that the protections could be offered in this system. So I don't anticipate it be a difficult ordinance in terms of the language, but certainly we can see what happens at that point in time.
And the other thing I was going to ask is that to make sure that there's clarity on this issue, when you provide the report, I'd much prefer it come through this committee than go in FSR where it gets lost in 8,000 other things. And so it could be a report that comes forward. And one of the recommendations, if it's not done at that time, is that upon approval that we're going to request the city attorney to do the appropriate ordinance.
Sure, I can make sure that
But that would be, I think, a better thing that we handle as a standalone report as you identify the changes in the funding.
I would do that. Thank you.
All right, we're going to move to item 2. So we just ask you to keep working, coming back to report to us. And again, when that report is done, we should ask the city attorney to create the ordinance necessary.
Okay.
When do you think that report would be?
Because of the fact that we do need that ordinance in place before we do all this, I will try for March
March?
to have everything done. We at this point, I think we're just trying to identify the mechanics of it with the Office of Treasurer.
All right. Let's just have this on the next agenda, and if we, is a verbal, and if there's a report, we can change it before we do the actual.
I think we got one
Okay.
phone, Mr. Chair. Revamping current assist tracking, documenting, reconcile, et cetera. How many times have we changed that system in the history of Dunn? Times have we changed that system to try and get in compliance? Or is it ever been changed?
I've only been with the department for about 5 years, and I recall only maybe perhaps like twice that they actually,
Try to change something?
try to change it where basically funding would be cut off if items were not turned in on time. So I'm just trying to actually implement the existing system.
Okay.
Because sometimes that has not been implemented.
So we are not really doing anything new. We're trying to implement what was already implemented. To enforce whatever was implemented.
Yeah, but I think the changes are the demand warrants go by the wayside, you're coming up with a cleaner system.
Right, and we're tracking better. I think that it just wasn't the ability to track before, so when we brought on this 120-day retired staff, that person was able to do some of this investigation.
And I think the last time we had a checking card or check system was when all the fraud came in. There wasn't sufficient guidelines and stuff.
No, Actually, although the checking account system was set up, it was never implemented.
Okay.
So that was, the problems with money came up in a different system.
Okay, all right.
Maybe we took the money away, we solved the problem. I'm just kidding.
Okay, let's go to item 2, and that's another verbal report, and we have no comment card, so.
Item number 2 is a verbal report from Dunn General Manager relative to the status of updating the roster of neighborhood councils on Dunn's website and email contribution list with current information on all neighborhood councils and the status of establishing individual email accounts for each neighborhood council.
The website has been updated with the rosters. We have the updated rosters, and we have put in place the 95 email addresses. And we discussed this last time of working with city clerk and perhaps having those email addresses added to their database so that they could send out the referral memorandums to the neighbor councils. We are investigating if that's the best possible use for them. I am concerned that if they were to receive such daily emails, and they might be overwhelmed by the information. So what we have done instead is to try to pull the council files that have been of most interest to the neighborhood councils and put that into our newsletter. I know the new lacity.org website also has a list of the most popular council files in one of the sections, so we've been monitoring that as well. And this next round of educational workshops for the neighborhood councils, we are collaborating with the city clerk to provide training on community impact statements, how to successfully advocate for what they would like to see, and also information on how to individually sign up for those referral memorandums if they are interested in that. So we will be distributing all of the email addresses to all the city council members so that they would have that information for them for their own use, as well as for the city departments.
Yeah. The one thing I think I saw your webpage and showing the most current or active files. I think it's a good section. The whole purpose, I was thinking about when we dealt with the city clerk's report, we hear constantly at the time we're getting ready to vote that somebody shows up and says, you're going to vote on this, and we didn't get 60 days to review it. Well, it's only been in file for 3 years. I mean, so what I wanted to do is rather than having done get into a filtering process for 97 different interests, is that if we start them off by giving them that daily report of motions by the city clerk, they then can pick their local issues or citywide issues and put it on the little envelope and get notified about it, and then it's within their hands. And lo and behold, when you filter, the first time something comes up that even though it's a local issue and they didn't get hand-fed, they're going to come back and say, nobody told me about it, I need 60 days to put it on the agenda. And what we're trying to do is say, on the one hand, when we first started this, they kept saying we wanted to be treated like city departments. You don't ask for what you don't realize it may not be beneficial. But the key is if you ask for access and it's available, then you take advantage of it. But we're trying to eliminate that argument, I just didn't know. And so, but again, I don't know if you or your staff have the ability to pick out 97 priorities in which might be of interest to the harbor and not to the valley and
Right.
things. But if you give them that city clerk report, they can skim that very quickly. And it's got the CF numbers on it. They can go right to that CF number and say, notify me, and get a registered email. That's totally on their hands. If you assume it, then it's almost where you have to come up with a tailor-made program for 96. You almost have to create, like you did with the ballots.
Right.
You have to come up with a tailor-made program
Yes.
for everyone's interest, and I just don't know if you could survive in doing that. So that's what I'm trying to do,
Yes.
is give them the city clerk's report, the same thing that council offices look at, the same thing that deputies look at, to keep track of what's going on, that their boss just issued a motion. How do you track it? You track it through the city clerk report that has a CF number. And that's how business is done. But to hear people come in and say, I've never heard of this, and the nerve of you to vote on it, and you said, it's been in committee for 3 years.
Right.
So that's what we're trying to.
I appreciate that point very much, and I think that what we wanted to do was a bit of easing them into all this information and train them first on what to do with this
Well, no, I think
information.
that training is very good.
Yes.
Because the thing is that they're, just understanding the council file system
Right.
takes some time and understanding. In fact, and I'm not really good on that system, but it took me a while to figure out where it was in the new webpage.
Right.
Because I was trying to figure out, because usually you're so used to just going to the right and say council file.
Yes.
Now you have to go to what's government or something and then find it within there. But it's an important tool if people truly are interested in keeping track of what's going on.
Yes, and I think that, we were trying to balance that and also overwhelming them to the point where it's just noise to them if every city department is giving them whatever their updates are on a daily basis.
That's why they have to leave.
Yes, and I have been letting them know when I go out in public that, you are now getting information that you've asked for, so please, review it, and if you don't want to, then do filters.
Well, the thing is that with the city clerk, I think they have the ability to delete themselves if they find it too overwhelming, but then they also need not show up and say, why didn't I know?
Right,
So it's a balance.
yes,
Even in a council office, if we only got the bare essentials of what we actually needed, we'd save a couple of trees. But in
Right.
order to decipher what you need, you got to go through a lot of paperwork, and no one can decide what the priorities of the council office except the council.
right,
So I think that's what we need to let them know, that no one has the time to figure out 97 different priorities of information. We can give you what we have, and if the city clerk can put those 97 emails in the system and notify them, and we teach them how to use council file, and they go to those city clerk reports, that now puts them on a par of saying, I can start keeping track of what's going on.
right. And this, again, it would be like the whole package, the training, and then this is how you get, yes, because I think that if we just put them on now, they wouldn't even know what's going on.
Turn loose on council file if
Yeah.
you don't know how to work it.
I agree.
That's good. No, thank you.
We'll move to item 3 on that. We'll just continue that item with updates.
That was 2. Item number 3
Yes.
is a verbal report from Dunn, General Manager, relative to the 2013-14 proposed departmental budget request.
Let me just ask Ida to come up. You have a comment on item 3?
Thank you very much. I'm very supportive of the neighborhood council system if it works. It's a wonderful way of civic engagement, but thus far, I have really found it to be restrictive and has not been welcoming of stakeholders. Stakeholders do not have a place in the neighborhood council system. The Dunn only wants to work with neighborhood councils, the elected members, and nobody else. The stakeholder cannot even go to their city attorney. You don't get answers. You're bounced back to your neighborhood council who doesn't want to deal with you. You go to your city council member and they don't want to deal with you either because it isn't in their purview. Where does the stakeholder then go? Nowhere. There is no venue. And I think that when you read the plan, it has wonderful parts in it, a grievance committee, a grievance section that has been dead for a number of years. It has a wonderful place there that says, if you are fiscally irresponsible, you will get decertified. 71 neighborhood councils have not really responded. Probably out of all of those, some of those deserve to be decertified because of their long history. Dunn has never applied the plan there. Therefore, when you look at their request for aid in their budget, you need to look whether these components are being truly addressed, because stakeholders deserve to be served.
Let me just comment on that, and I think just give this general manager an opportunity. I think we've seen more progress in the time she's been the acting and now permanent general manager than we saw in the years prior to that. So just give her a chance to get involved. That plan is going to be updated. We're talking about their commission is looking at whether there should be charter changes and to make this more streamlined. We gave the direction from this committee to deal with the financial issues as a priority, and that's why she's addressed that, and the communication with the on the webpage to let so we know who the neighborhood council officers are. They all have an email system. Those are all priorities that were directed by this committee. So just give her a chance, and the other things such as the grievance and process certainly will follow along. Okay.
Thank you, Council Member. In
I
regards,
second his motion, by the way.
thank you, Council Member. In regards to our proposed 2013-14 department budget request, we were really trying to be very aware that, we are in a fiscal climate that is very challenging, and to not ask for too much. We really wanted to just only request what we think that we need in regards to some of our priorities. And, one of the major priorities, obviously, is to improve the funding program. We also wanted to focus on education and training so that we can, teach neighborhood councils city policies and procedures and how to be a part of the city family. We wanted to make sure that all policies and systems were in place. That includes implementing any changes in the plan that the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners and the City Council approves in the next couple months. We also provide direct assistance to the neighborhood councils when they are struggling, and we are trying to reach out with our peer mentors, Councils for Councils group, as well as the Valley Alliance of Neighborhood Councils resource group to try to have them help us when we have neighborhood councils that are having challenges because of our staffing levels. And we still actually provide the administrative support for the neighborhood councils, such as negotiating their contracts and their leases, and doing anything in regards to implementation of even just getting their RICO copiers, temp services, all of that. In our requested budgets, the total budget was it's about $2.8 million requested, and that includes funding request for the neighborhood council funding program redesign. We We didn't ask for a specific position because we weren't sure, after the funding program was redesigned, what we would actually end up with. And so we requested $250,000 that was going to be applied to as-needed positions, and so that we would only use what we needed, and anything that was not used could be returned back to the city. We were also relying on the $120,000 that I mentioned earlier that was from salary savings last fiscal year. That was for development of electronic platform. As I mentioned, that was inadvertently left out of our current budget, so we are trying to get that back into our budget numbers. The policy development and reform aspect of what I mentioned earlier, we did ask for one existing senior project coordinator, as well as funding in the amounts of $20,000 to cover policy updates. This position also would cover the mayor's budget day, which actually runs the entire year, not just the one day that they do at City Hall, and also the Congress of Neighborhood Councils, which is one day but also requires probably about 8 months of planning. In that $2.8 million, we also included the neighborhood council elections, a package for that, which in the following agenda items I can talk more about, but in total, the request was for $685,338, and this was including as-needed positions and one position for a project coordinator, which we have subsequently changed to a management analyst 2, and also a position for project assistant. And this amount also includes translation, anything with arbitration in terms of challenges, as well as the payments for independent election administrators and any other as-needed staff. Did you have any other questions in regards to?
Let me just ask you one thing. On your comment regarding holding over funds from one fiscal year to the next, what would that be used for? And are you looking at that for just this one fiscal year, or an annual, not sweep the amount? And would that be managed by Dunn, or is it money going back to the neighborhood council? Just give me some insight on what you're looking at.
In regards, are you talking specific about the 120 that I mentioned earlier, from that one salary savings from one fiscal year to the next?
Yes.
So that actually was set aside initially for an electronic funding platform. Since we started this at the beginning of this fiscal year, the department was looking for actually less expensive ways to monitor the funding department. As a result, we were thinking that we could apply, if we didn't need the full funding platform, it was initially estimated around that much, but it was the whole shebang type of funding, electronic funding platform that it looks like we don't really need if we do this funding overhaul. What we would like to do is try to get that to actually staff the as-needed that we need to set up the system, and then we estimate that we would not have to ask for that every fiscal year after that.
So the platform money is what you're looking to fund these positions in next fiscal year?
Correct.
Now, how would they be funded subsequent years?
Well, these positions, as I was mentioning, we think that is more of a setup. It was more an as-needed setup, so that we wouldn't need to subsequently fund them for additional years after that. As I mentioned, though, unfortunately, that the $120,000 was inadvertently left out of our existing budget, so we are trying to find a method of trying to get that back, because we don't know if City Council or Mayor's Office or CAO would be able to actually accommodate the $250,000 request that we put in for those funding as-needed positions.
And this is part of your 13-14 budget, what these recommendations?
Correct, those recommendations. But the $120,000 is not, because we did not realize it was not included in the existing budget until after our budget already went through.
So how are you going to deal with that and asking not have it swept?
I think we're going to ask kind council members to probably support us in trying to regain the $120,000 into our budget.
Yeah, because I think it's easier to try to keep it from being swept than having it reinstated.
Yes, and unfortunately, the way, our budget is looking, we may have those types of funds available to try to put back in place, but at this point, we're not sure.
Have you already had your budget hearings?
No, I actually have that hearing tomorrow.
That may be something you put on the table about, because as you know, between now and June, it's going to be major sweep time. So.
Yes, I understand that, yes.
A couple questions. You had the 2013-14 proposed department budget request. You broke down different numbers.
Mhm.
What's the total budget request for done?
It's approximately 2.8, but it's $2,792,145.
Okay, so 2.8 million just for done to run done.
Correct.
What's the current budget?
The current budget is 2.3 million, approximately.
So you're going up from 2.3 to 2.8?
Yes.
I thought you said it's hard economic times.
It is hard economic times, but also the issue is, and that's why we asked for mostly as-needed positions, because we were hoping that we would only use what we needed and we could just, revert the remaining funds that we don't use back to the general fund. The other thing too is what we're considering, and was your concern that you mentioned before, Councilmember Zine, is just the oversight needed to monitor the funding program. I think that, we open ourselves up to liability not only under the funding program, but also under, meeting operations in terms of violations of various city policies and procedures that may happen at neighborhood council levels, because we are unable to monitor and keep up the oversight for neighborhood councils.
Have you tried utilizing interns or volunteers? Like the city attorney's office has a number of law students that they use to help shore up some of the cost cutting. Have you done any of that to get, like the police department has a reserve corps where reserves come and they work for free. Have we tried to reach out to get any of those folks that have time on their hands and would like to help out?
We have reached out for interns at the various universities, and that has been helpful when we've been able to get them. I can follow up with city attorney in regards to their law clerks. I'm not sure what their capacity is to bring them on to our side. We have been looking to use student professional workers instead at a lower cost. We are looking at many cost-saving measures, and I think one of them is teaming up with the peer mentors that we've identified in the existing system. These great volunteers have come forward and have offered their services throughout the city, and they literally drive all over the city to help struggling neighborhood councils, and they work in partnership with us. And this is the Councils for Councils program I was speaking of earlier. And also the Valley Alliance of Neighborhood Councils, they have their resource board that they've been doing the same thing. So we did identify that in our budget as something that we like to continue doing. However, we would ideally like to offer them some type of stipend for mileage or whatnot, because they drive very far distances and they're just volunteering their time right now. It's a great service to the city.
I was in San Pedro, I think it was Friday night, and I went to the Cabrillo Museum, and they honored the 200 volunteers. That museum under Rex and Parks is basically run by volunteers, docents and volunteers. They have a couple of paid staff, and I was amazed how many volunteers they have running that in the interest of the neighborhood councils, those folks that are retired, those folks who worked it, those folks who have that interest and knowledge. I don't know where the budget's going. I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Parks, doesn't know where the budget's going, but with that 2.3 to 2.8 increase, in addition to what other agencies are looking for, with the dollars that aren't really mounting up as people anticipate, it might be a tough struggle. And that doesn't include the dollars that go to the neighborhood councils and to their leasing of office space, et cetera.
Right.
So what would be the total, if you have the 2.8 you're asking, if you include the rental of offices and equipment, what would be the total budget for done?
The rental offices that the neighborhood councils pay for themselves.
Yeah, but that comes out of the money they get.
Yeah, the $37,000. Correct.
And I know there was a letter that came through, they'd like to get 50 again. So
Correct.
do you know what the recommendation is for the funding for neighborhood councils?
My understanding is right now it's at $37,000. We were not instructed to provide any other figures in terms of cutting.
And that total of the 90, I think you're going to have another one today, if it's approved, another neighborhood council that's being formed, Porter Ranch?
Oh, no, that's a renaming.
That's already named?
No, it's a renaming of a community. It's not a neighborhood council.
Okay, so
Yeah.
you have, you said 95.
There's 95, and there's money set aside for potentially 2 other neighborhood councils in the South LA area if they were to get certified next year.
Okay, so that'd be 97, so close to 100.
Correct, 97.
Okay, and then obviously that 2.3 to 2.8 would just mushroom because of the stipend they would get. Do they get anything else other than that 37,000?
The 37,000, and that's separate from the 2.8. That's
Right,
not
but
included,
do they get
right?
anything else other than that? 37 is it? It used to be 50 and they went down, but 37 is what they
It's
get.
only
and they get-
37, and as you mentioned, I know that, I think the budget advocates and as well as the board neighbor commissioners have recommended that their stipend be increased back to the 50, or restored back to the 50.
Right, no, I understand that, okay. And we'd like to help them out as much as we can with what we have in the pot. The fire department's asking for money, the police department's asking for
I agree.
everybody's asking for money.
Yes, I understand.
I have a 2 o'clock that I have to excuse myself, but I will, do you want to recommend on that, or?
Yeah, I think on this one, on the, we'll just note and file this information and monitor this during the budget.
Excuse myself, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Zine.
But item 4,
Item 4 is a verbal status report from the city attorney relative to the recommendations for standardizing the factual basis stakeholder definition, qualifications, and documentation.
Deputy City Attorney Darren Martinez. Councilmember, one of the items that I would point out is if you do look at the next report that's on the agenda, the department has included some of the discussion that we've had regarding factual basis stakeholders, and that'll be on page 5 and 6 of that report. So some of what I can give a brief overview now, and then I'll just answer any questions if you have, regarding this definition. One of the items that I wanted to point out is the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners has set up these 3 regional panels throughout the city. There's been some for the Valley, some for the Central area, some for the East area of Los Angeles. Each of them has had at least one opportunity now to meet, and we've discussed what the definition is of this stakeholder, or what a stakeholder is, or who that should be under the current system. There's a lot of interesting discussion occurring at that level, and probably a consensus about, the type of stake that should be involved in a community in order for somebody to be a stakeholder, to be able to be a board member, and to be able to vote for that board. As you may know, one of the difficulties or the problems that we have is with the current definition of stakeholder, it was expanded beyond the charter terms of live, work, or own property to also include any individual who declares a stake in the neighborhood and affirms the factual basis for it.
I was going to ask you, is that legal, that you can expand on the charter as opposed to stay within the charter language?
Well, yes, it would have been problematic if you tried to say, if the charter said live, work, or own property, and you tried to eliminate the own property person.
So you can expand on it or interpret it.
You can make it consistent with the charter without, you're not, it's not illegal. The definition is not illegal.
The thing I have a concern about in reading the material and also number 5 is how do you figure that out? I mean, it's one thing, it's fairly simple. I work here, I own property here, or I reside here. But when you start trying to interpret the ongoing relationships, who has the staff and the time to figure that out in the sense of saying, it's almost gets to the point when people are very sensitive about voting and elections. Even in our ongoing elections, people get very sensitive if you begin to ask them questions beyond what's on the voter registration. So I'm trying to, who figures that out to determine the qualifications? If we set some wording, who's going to be the one that interprets that someone fits within the guidelines?
Well, the key, or where this comes up really, is in the administration of the elections. So for example, when the department is determining who is that person who is a stakeholder and allowed to vote, that's really when this issue is at its, most crucial, or when there's the most issues surrounding
Most
it.
of the things that I saw in here that you would be recommending requires some research. You just normally wouldn't just say, well, I have a kid in school, or I basically attend LA City College and I've been there for 5 years, whatever. There's going to be some research, who does that, and in what level of depth are we requiring to be able to make that definition a reality?
Well, we're getting a little bit more into the administration of the election issue, which is different from the definition itself. But when the department is trying to figure out that person who's a stakeholder that's come to them, they'll usually, and please feel free to jump in, Gracie, if there's anything you'd like to add. But
What you say, is it the department that does that, or the neighborhood council that does the determination?
the department will do it through the independent election administrator. So when they're processing the voter, first they look to what the neighborhood council chose. Some neighborhood councils, well, they have an option. They can choose, somebody can just sign a declaration, I affirm that I'm a stakeholder, and that's the basis for it, and they take it at the value of
Do
the
they say what
statement that's made.
Do they, on that affidavit, do they say specifically, what is it that qualifies them? I'm attending school, or?
I believe so. Do they?
Yes, it depends on the neighborhood council. They can do what we call self-affirmation or documentation. So if they self-affirm, we believe them. They say, we have a child there, and that's up to the neighborhood council to determine. If it's documentation, the city clerk in 2010, they put together a really great list of acceptable documentation. And for instance, a parent of such a child could have the school provide a letter that would state that I am the parent of a child attending the school, and we would be able to take that as their
But
documentation.
Can you decipher all that, say, on election day, when somebody shows up and says, I want to vote?
Yes, we go out of our way to provide them the ability to vote, and if for some reason they cannot provide that documentation, they vote provisionally, and then they have 3 days to provide us proper documentation.
Because, in reading it, on the one hand, you're trying to give people a broader access. On the other hand, if you go with the saying they can have 1 seat or 2 seats, it's almost like a throwaway. We don't know who they are. We're just going to limit their access by saying you could only fill 2 of our 10 seats or whatever. So you're betwixt and between trying to work around a definition that's almost like smoke.
It has been challenging, yes.
Good term, challenging. But the thing is that, are we making, do we expect coming out of those regional committees by the commission that they're going to come up with something workable, or is that going to fall on the shoulders of the department or the city attorney? Where are we going to get the substance for that definition?
Well, I think we're both working in conjunction with the committees. We're allowing them kind of the opportunity just to have that fundamental discussion about who is a stakeholder, who is it that they mean to be participating in the neighborhood.
Who's a part of those regional meetings? Is that neighborhood councils?
They've been appointed or selected by the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. I guess each of the neighborhood councils nominated some individuals to serve on the committee. So it was actually a standing committee that was created of the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners. Will ultimately try to have a joint meeting among all of them, and then have the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners come back with some recommendations as well.
My only concern is in trying to have access, that we not pile on paper and administrative overhead trying to figure out all these nuances. And I don't know whether, I would assume if somebody wants to be on the board, it's worth it to them to have this kind of a generic definition. But on the other hand, for the process for Dunn and everyone else, what is the requirement and time and effort to decipher this? And that's the key, is that, and again, I'm assuming that the neighborhood council boards can decide they don't want to have such a position on their board. Or are we saying it's mandatory?
They do have to have a position on their board for all their stakeholders. So every stakeholder has to have at least the opportunity to be on the board and to vote. Some neighborhood councils will set up their seats in such a way where, they have people that live, work, students, religious organizations.
21 different ballots.
Yes, they can set it up to be very, very restrictive, and then they would have, as you say, possibly that throwaway seat that catches all the other types of stakeholders, if that was the definition.
In the report that's coming up, it was mind-boggling that people would have 21 ballots and 14 people can get you elected. I mean, that's a lot of process for very little nugget at the end of all that process. So that's the kind of balance is that, in the sense of trying to give people access, but on the other hand, that you don't fill it up with so much administrative overhead that it becomes unwieldy. And we'll deal with it in the next report, even those that had this so precise system of 21 different ballots, they confuse people so much that many people said, I don't want to vote. That's the last thing you want to get to is I don't want to vote after you've created this several $100,000 process to come in and have people say who they want to represent them in this neighborhood council process. So that's the balance. So I'm just looking to make sure that, and again, if when we say every constituency has to have an ability to vote, to have something that's so nebulous as factual base, just seems it just goes contrary to what the charter says here. It's very clear. You live, work, or play in this district, and yet we're coming up with something that kind of, I think when we think about the number of positions, it probably took more of your time to deal with these factual-based things than all of the other 11 or 1,200 people that got elected.
Yes, as I mentioned before, it was challenging. Sometimes if they didn't have any documentation, for instance, how do you document that you go attend a park or that you go to the dog park regularly? I mean, we basically had to resort to take a picture of you in the park with your dog, and we could tell that was that area, and we would accept that because there was nothing else that we could have that would document that.
On that example, if you go to the dog park, in reality, as a stakeholder, are your interests greater than the use of the dog park? I mean, do you deserve a seat on the larger board to talk about all of the land use issues and everything else that goes on in neighborhood council because you happen to be a dog owner and go to this park? I don't know if that equates to my mind.
And I think that's the decision that the neighborhood councils are kind of grappling with right now, and in the committee and the commissioners and ultimately city council will have to take a look at again.
Well, I say we will, on this item, when do we think those regional committees are going to be narrowing down their work?
They should be done. I did ask the commission to put this issue first before them because they're going to look at a bunch of other issues as well. So I'm hoping that they'll be done within the next week, and we'll have their reports back to the commission, and so that the commission can put together a report to forward to city council, a recommendation, so that we can try to get this done before neighborhood councils can no longer change their board structure, because once July 1st hits, we have to start prepping for the elections in 2014.
All right. Can we expect maybe by April that your report on this issue come to this committee? Is that sufficient time?
Okay, I think would it be the commission's report that comes forward? I believe it's a commission's report.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the commission was going to make a recommendation based on what their finding is, and then that could...
So can we can plan for that to be on the April agenda? That should give us time to get it to council well before the July.
Yeah, we'll try from March, but definitely by April.
Okay, all right. And then just for the record, what is that? We have one community impact statement that was presented to us by Eagle Rock Neighborhood Council. So just for the record. Okay, well, we'll look for that in April from the commission's report and trying to come up with a guidelines for factual base definition and then guidelines. Okay. All right, item 5.
Item 5 is consideration of an application to name a community Porter Ranch. Application approved for filing on June 3rd, 2011. 6. I'm sorry. Item number 5, report from the Department of Neighborhood Empowerment, General Manager relative to the 2012 Neighborhood Council elections and encumbrances related to Neighborhood Council election outreach.
Ida, you had a card on that one?
I think that, thank you. I think that elections are the basics, the foundations for civic engagement. It is a tool that has been fought for, even if it's a neighborhood council. It is a very important part of the structure for democracy. However, at the neighborhood council, this has not come across clearly, and we are floundering. I asked about our having a referendum on our election when the neighborhood council had it, and I never heard back. Having a referendum and other things on a neighborhood council is very important because it's one chance to reach people. I also asked about recalls, and I never heard anything. I would like to have a recall as part of this, and I would like to have it happen now in my community. We have appealed and appealed to the former board, the new board, everybody, and it hasn't worked. Done. How do we go about it? I would like that assistance because that is another democratic tool. When everything else fails, we have a recall. And I would like Ms. Liu and Dunn to assist us in this passage because it is a tool that needs to be available. Thank you.
I'm sure that as we go through the plan and looking at the new procedures, that will be incorporated. Okay, let's go to number 5.
Councilmember, would you like me to summarize the report, or do you
Yes,
have questions?
I
directly?
just had a couple of questions, but if you can summarize it for the body, then we can move
No,
from there.
no problem.
Let me just do one thing. I'm thinking about it.
Sure.
On number 4,
Yes.
let me just add one instruction that when this comes back with the report from the commission for our April meeting, is that a company that we should have the COCLA have reviewed it and comment on that report. Okay, now we go to 5.
For the 2012 Neighborhood Council elections, the department conducted 75 elections and 5 what we call board affirmations. A board affirmation is basically when the Neighborhood Council didn't have enough contested seats, so in order to save money, the cost-saving measure, we did a board affirmation instead of those candidates that had applied for the existing seats. There are 3 neighborhood councils that ultimately did not have enough candidates to meet the quorum of the board structure, so they fell under what the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners call the loss of quorum policy, where the department would assist them in holding special selections instead. So we did that for 3 neighborhood councils. There were 9 neighborhood councils that conducted their own elections, and then ultimately 3 other neighborhood councils weren't up for elections until 2014. Of the $550,000 of fiscal year funds this current fiscal year funds that we were provided to administer the elections, we spent approximately $444,000. So we had about a little over $100,000 savings. We did charge neighborhood councils for vote by mail. There were 23 neighborhood councils that did utilize vote by mail, and they paid $500 setup fee for that. And then they would pay that covered 200 pieces of mailings, and then anything that was over that amount, they would just only cover the cost of the postage. We did do outreach for the neighborhood council elections. We assisted in both the department and the independent election administrators assisted in elections at the citywide level, at the regional level, and the neighborhood councils also focused on their individual areas as well. We conducted Leadership Academy workshops. We did 26 of those. We did 11 candidate forum workshops, 8 poll worker workshops, and dozens of candidate forums across the city. Our website was actually very successful as well. We averaged about 2,632 hits a day during the election cycle. So neighborhood councils in the previous fiscal year, they could encumber their funds for election outreach. Last year, they encumbered approximately $444,000 in election outreach, and they had a certain date by which they had to apply for those funds in order for them to utilize those funds. Otherwise, it came out of current fiscal year funds. And as of now, it looks like we have approximately $150,000 that will be swept from that original amount because neighbor councils either did not apply by the deadline for those funds, or they didn't utilize as much of the funds as they had anticipated. Some of the issues that came up that we are looking at for the 2014 election cycle is, as Councilmember you noted before, the multiple ballot types. We did create 291 unique ballots for the neighborhood councils that range from, some neighborhood councils had just one ballot style, and some had up to 21 ballot styles. Those that had the higher number of ballots, as I mentioned before, sometimes it was confusing to voters, and sometimes it limited the number of votes that the neighborhood council candidates actually received. So although you may see a neighborhood council that had perhaps 300 or so voters attend their election, because of the number of ballot styles, sometimes most of their candidates won with fewer than 12 votes. So we're thinking in terms of the cost savings and also just simplification. We're going to encourage neighborhood councils to look at their board structures and see if they can simplify their voting structure. If they choose not to do that, we are considering actually charging additional funds to prepare ballots that are over 10 types of ballot styles, because it is costly for us to print out all those ballots. Vote by mail comprised of 8.1% of the total ballots cast, and what we're thinking, because of how difficult it was to do a documented vote by mail, that in 2014 we'll likely only be doing vote by mail for those neighborhood councils who verify their voters via self-affirmation. A lot of voters did not want to send their documents over email or via the mail system to us for us to verify that they were qualified voters. As the city attorney already noted, we did have the issue of the factual basis stakeholder in several neighborhood councils where folks would bring in a receipt, something they purchased that day to qualify as a voter. Some voters actually took one receipt and then they would pass it around to various other folks, and so we basically put a stop to that by marking up the receipt so that it couldn't be passed after that, passed on to other folks. So we are working right now with City Attorney, CAO, CLA, and Council Member Weezer's office to further define the factual basis stakeholder definition, along with the Board of Neighborhood Commissioners and the neighborhood councils. So we hope to have that resolved in the next couple months so that they can have that opportunity to change their board structure if the new definition is passed by City Council. And then lastly, we are looking forward to working with the Office of the City Clerk in collaboration to administer the 2014 Neighborhood Council elections. We have worked out a strategy where the department would focus on working with our independent election administrators and doing outreach and collaborating with neighborhood councils on their elections, while the city clerk would focus on what we call the back office function, which would be candidate verification, vote by mail, processing of surveys, ballot preparation, trying to streamline the process, but also working to make it more efficient so that we focus on our individual strengths as departments. So we've basically come up with a proposal that fits the current budget package ask of the department, which is the $685,000, and we would be giving a portion of that to the city clerk so that they could administer that portion of the elections, and that's approximately $115,000. That concludes my report.
One thing, on our recent meeting, there's a report forthcoming of making that recommendation of the merged effort between you and the city clerk for future elections.
You know, my apologies, council member. I didn't realize that I should have put a recommendation that very pointedly in the report that states that that's the city attorney be asked to prepare that language. My understanding is that we were going to rely on this report to move that forward.
Now, is that required, is that an ordinance, because was that an ordinance that we changed it from the clerk to Dunn? Now we got to make it a joint effort?
If I remember correctly, I thought we just did a temporary transfer, so we would need to change it now to be however we want to do it, because it's going to default back entirely to the city clerk if nothing changes at this point in time.
Ordinance for that.
If we're going to have Dunn and the city clerk do some kind of
And
joint
there's
effort,
enough
yes.
substance in this report for your recommendation to go forward on that.
Yes, sir, there is. There is a request actually on page 7, right before the conclusion, that city council instructs the city attorney to prepare the ordinance changes. I just wasn't called out so directly.
All right. Let me, one thing on this report, we'll basically note and file it, but one of the things I want to ensure that's in the body of the committee report, that issues dealing with, in this report, that deal with the factual-based stakeholder is going to be addressed specifically in CF number 12-1682 that will be forthcoming in April. The other issue is that strongly endorse on page 7, the recommendations that Dunn and the city clerk merged their efforts in the 2014 neighborhood council elections and asked the city attorney to create the necessary ordinance to implement that. And then the final thing is that we asked Dunn to meet with those neighborhood councils that have these multiple election formats and either restrain or come up with an alternative so that the outcomes are do not diminish people's involvement, and that we have a more standardized election process so that we can save money, time, and eliminate waste as relates to the ballots. So if we can add those instructions and move that report as a note and file, but we do want to instruct the city attorney to create that ordinance so we can move forward on the 2014 election. Does
I will do
cover all
that.
of the main issues?
Yes, sir, I believe it does.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We go to item 6, and we have Mr. Rippey.
Good afternoon, Chairman Parks, members of the committee. Okay. My name is Dick Rippey. I am a member of the Porter Ranch Neighborhood Council Board. I come to you today to thank you, number one, for putting this on your agenda and hopefully for your approval of this item. I not only represent the Porter Ranch Neighborhood Council, but also 540 stakeholders who signed a petition to officially name Porter Ranch. The postal zip code 91326 was changed in 2008 from Northridge to Porter Ranch. The stakeholders feel passage of this name change will complete the identity of our community. We have had complete community support for this item with no opposition that I know of from anyone or any other neighborhood councils. We have the support of Council District 12, Mitch Englander. Please don't disappoint the Porter Ranch Neighborhood Council or the 540 stakeholders who signed the petition. I hope you will agree and send this council file to the City Council with the Education and Neighborhoods Committee approval. Thank you for your time and hopefully your approval.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions. How many public meetings or hearings were held on this item?
It was on our agenda for the Porter Ranch Neighborhood Council at least 5 times, and I give a report on it almost monthly as to where it stands.
Okay. And then, but this covers how many neighborhood councils in the area?
We border on 3 neighborhood councils, Granada Hills North, Chatsworth, and Northridge West.
Okay, have they taken a position on this?
They did not take a position. I have been to Northridge West Neighborhood Council frequently. They have no opposition to it.
Okay, but none of their territory are within these boundaries?
None of the what?
None of the 3 neighborhood councils' territory are within this Porter Ranch boundaries?
Correct.
Okay, so this is a standalone neighborhood council,
Yes.
and these are bordering, the other 3 are bordering?
The others are borders, yes.
Okay, we'll move that item and approve the name change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Ida, you have a public comment card?
Yeah, you have asked me or asked us to basically give Ms. Gracie Liu a chance to implement all of the changes that have been proposed. I think that many of these changes are much needed, and however, our community has suffered intensely. To ask them to wait with no respite in between is to demand a great deal from them, and that is most unfair, because if justice is not done on a daily basis and there is equitable treatment, transparency, which should be the cornerstone, then I think there are questions that are very important that need to be raised. As I said, the issue of recall is there, and we would like to exert it, and that we should be given a chance during this interim period to exert our rights as a community. And if it fails, so be it. But this is a tool we need to try. I thank you for the amount of work that you have done and for the fairness that you have shown us or me when I have been here. I do thank you for that.
Thank you very much for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you. We have no other cards and we have no agenda items.
None.
So we're